talk about data, let alone big data for the time being. Data, I'll be talking about that. And secondly, I am in the Arts Festival as marketing director, and therefore I will be talking about the market and marketing. And for those of us who are in the arts, you may find marketing a bit far from you, but perhaps not again. So I'll be talking about the commercial field and management, how some of that information or knowledge about data can be used in our realm. So data or big data and marketing strategy. In that midst, we're going to ask 3 questions. The first question is, what kind of data? How do we capture the data? And then another question is, how do we ask for the data? What exactly are we asking for? And thirdly, this kind of data or information, what goals or strategies can we set on the basis of these data? So we're really talking about different balls of different sizes. That's data going into a funnel. The data come from all sides, and at the end of the day, we want to rationalize and be able to use the data at the other end of the funnel. So this session is going to be perhaps a little bit difficult for you because we cannot very well describe what data is. For our market, perhaps customer demographic, personal information, age, name, etc., your experience, etc. That may be it, customer demographic. And then purchase preference and history, what kind of preferences you have, what are the purchases history, and information portal, and that is what kind of things you want to scroll and look at. What are some of your mobile phone apps? That's portal UI UX interaction. And ads. Now, after the ads have been delivered, what are the ads that are really effective and which are not? And then there's social media. How do you interact with your social media? And then lastly, what is very trendy now is DM, direct messaging interaction. Direct messaging would be some instant messages on your phone, things like that. So all these data, apart from software, there are different platforms for collection of these data through these applications. For those of you who have been involved in data gathering, you would know some of them. But I can tell you I cannot very well talk about each of the icons today, because for each of the platforms, there is a lot of different ways of collecting the data, different types of data, different ways of using the data. And therefore, in data, especially for those in the artistic field, the first question they ask is, how should we go about it? And what are some of the tools we can use? And I would think we can use a metaphor for that. Let me perhaps give you an example. There are many tools here, but to choose a tool, let's say to get certain data, first of all, we have to ask what kind of data, how to get that data. So you have to identify these as the first questions. And to give you an example, if you have a flat and you need to renovate the flat, and after that, let's say there is this space in the kitchen, you can put a machine there, you can put in a washing machine for washing your clothes in this space. But for some people, they say perhaps a better use of the space is to use a washing dryer machine. So the solution perhaps is not just not to wash clothes, but to wash dishes. So the third choice is a dishwashing machine. So these 3 are all different. These 3 machines have different functions. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, do you want to wash clothes or dishes? That's the first question. And then you would say there's only one space. Can that space accommodate all 3 functions? perhaps washing plus drying, at least washing plus drying, 2 functions in one. Can I fit that into the space? Yes, you can. But some people say washer dryer machines actually does not wash very clean, or it consumes a lot of electricity. But would there be washing drying machines for clothes plus dishwashing? Maybe there are. I don't know of one though. But if you look at the diagram just now, for each of the tools, we're collecting one type of data. So for this tool or platform, the data that it collects, is it the right data? Is it what you want to collect? So you have to ask what kind of data you want to get. And for each section, I'll have a knowledge cycle for you, and that is, how do you accumulate your knowledge? So as we're saying, the first question is, what kind of knowledge do you want? So you first have to ask a question, what kind of data do you want? And then you go on to the next step. What tool to get that information or data? And this tool, does it come with its own dependencies or preconditions? In IT, we call it dependency in the implementation of this tool. So there are certain conditions before you can use that tool. So you know what you want to get, and then you know the tool to get that information or data. And then using that tool, you will know what is collected, what data is collected, what are the metrics of the data, what are the characteristics, the size, the frequency, and what they represent. And then lastly, now that you have collected the data, of course, you want to collect more data. So we will have to analyze what data is outstanding. And this tool cannot get at the data, or you just don't know how to use it to fully to get more data, and what data is not acquired, and why is that kind of data missing, how to get more complete data. So this is a knowledge cycle. I'll give you an example. For myself, let's say this is a use case that I would raise as follows. Let's say on my website, I want to collect user behavior. Let's say what they click on, what they view as video, and how they play the games, what kind of games, and how long they play, and what kind of buttons do they click. So that's very popular, right, for websites, that kind of user behavior collection. I can't tell you all the tools today, but I can perhaps introduce to you Google Tag Manager, which fires certain triggers. That is, when you click, it would fire on certain signals. And then another platform, Google Analytics, would collect all this user data. And after that, there will be a report generated, or a data stream, we say, being generated. Now, I'll give you a screen to show you what's collected. Next week, on Monday, there will be a new project launched. And this project is the Arts Festival. It's an Arts Festival co-organized event. And on the left-hand side, you see there's a lot of things jumping, a lot of jumping data. And that is, as you click, with every interaction on that web page, your clicks are being collected. And it's all sent to Google Analytics, what you put in, input as information. The data stream is actually very active. And for the data stream, I would be able to get all that data from that data stream. But what does it mean to have that data stream? We don't know yet. We only know that we have captured that data stream. All right, now that you've got the data stream, you are faced with a question. Now that you have it, how do you make sense of it? But before we go to that question, at least for this knowledge cycle, it is successful because you want the data, you've got the data now, and you want to also find out what other data is missing, what's not there just yet. All right, for the first question, what to get and how to get the data, there are a couple of challenges there. And what are these challenges? And that is, there are multiple touch points for your data. And these touch points will have to be, you have to find these touch points. And because there are different data types, and let's say for the website, there are videos, there are time data, clicks data, et cetera, And just now, you saw some form filling on that website. So there's personal information as well. So there are different types of data, and they're stored in different places. And then in between platforms, in between tools, the platforms would be different. And also, the data cannot be equivalent. The data sets will not be equivalent among datas. A does not equal B. So there will be multiple incompatibility among the platforms in managing the data. So you have to have some expertise in implementation. So the takeaway one is that you have to know your tools in getting answers from your data. So you have to know your tools. What tools do you have on hand? And which tool can get you what data? That you have to know. That's the first question. That's the first takeaway for the first question. So the first question, let's revisit what data, how to get the data. And I've just mentioned to you just now, the Google Analytics is one tool for website-related data. And subscribers interaction data. That was our example just now. And let's go to the second question, which is a bit deeper. How do we make sense of the data that we've collected so that the data is really useful for you? Now, in the knowledge or study of data, very often this is how we segregate data into different levels. What we collected just now, we saw in the example, that's data, and that's at the lowest level. And we have to pay attention to the data quality, whether the data is really accurate, say. And then the next level would be forming the data into information, and from information to knowledge, and then from knowledge to wisdom. And with wisdom, you can formulate your strategies. Now, information is a quality of information. And when we turn information into knowledge, it basically informs our decision quality, whether the decision is correct, whether the decision is good or not. And lastly, wisdom determines our business outcome. That is our final goal, what our entity or business concern wants to achieve. So this is data, and it moves up the pyramid to information, knowledge, and then to wisdom. Now, there is a cycle to this process as well. First of all, we accumulate data, moving to information. There is a cycle unto itself. Firstly, what kind of information do we have on hand? Just now we asked the question, what kind of data we want to gather. Now that we've gathered the data, then we have to ask ourselves, what is the structure of our data? And that is how to structure that. Some of the data cannot give us certain answers to questions. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the query? For friends in the database business, query means It means a command for the database. You have to write a statement before you can put up a query. And is this data comparable? Just now, we said that databases may not be comparable. A does not equal B. Something in a piece of information A doesn't mean that it's the same as B. So now that we have the structure, we do the analysis. We analyze the information. What is the top line information? That is what you want to know most of all. What do you want to know most of all? You form a question of it. And can we use this information in a visualized format? Can we use a pic or a graph to show the information? How do we visualize that analysis? And then with the analysis, are there certain trends that we can see? Are there insights that we can glean from it? Now, let me give you an example here. Now, we've raised the website example just now, and my role is in marketing. The most popular question we ask is, let's say, the post on Facebook, did people like it? The advertisement we put up, is it worth our while? And what's the feedback? And the videos that we have sent, what are some of the videos that are more welcome than others, more popular than others? And all these have to do with interactions, website, advertising, social media, referrals, etc. Let's say I already have the website information, that is website users' behavior. I have that data. And I also have advertising efficacy data. Let's say I have those information. And thirdly, I will have to find out what are some of the social media, feedback, people who click like, and then really come back to the website. So we have these three things. And then we have to ask, how do we structure the data? This is something that takes perhaps a few hours at least for an intro into this, how to structure the data. But all I'm going to say here is that we have certain ways of having UTM be put into Google Analytics. And Google Analytics will have its own structure, let's say user level, hit level, etc. And then Google Analytics, they'll be able to reveal all this information or data in a visual form. So how do we analyze the information? The most popular tool is, as mentioned, Google Analytics. It is a software. And give you an example, let's say the website that we were talking about. And very quickly, let me give you an overview of these graphs. And I'm sure you're perhaps familiar with these graphs. These are linear graphs. The blue line is this week, the orange line last week. And the information down under are already categorized. Let's say website interaction, social media interaction had already been categorized. And let's say for website interaction, its components are also categorized. So you would be able to see, say, last week, the advertisements, let's say, those are liked by people were however many percentage of all the advertisements, and how many people actually subscribed or took action to register with us, or the posts were not all that good and reaction dropped, etc. Then with this information, you'll be able to answer the question, what information you want. Now, as in washing machine, let's say we had a washing machine example just now. We had 3 types of machines. So this is a tool for you. I assume you know the washing machine and the dishwashing machine, etc. You know the functions of these three. Now, if you want to renovate your flat, you know about these tools, but what you want to next ask is a living question. All these tools are usable, and what you need to ask is not what you want to fit into this space, but for this kind of a flat, what kind of machine you can use. Let's say, for instance, let's say if you want a dryer, a good dryer, maybe you need to use town gas and not electricity. Perhaps you need water source. And for machine, in between machines, you need connections, how to connect up machines. You need planning for all these. And therefore, in this case, when we know all this and we have analyzed this, different systems, when we interconnect these systems, when we do that, we will get insights. So we will be able to answer yet another question. Now, different platforms and different channels have different protocols. So, and these are agreements, protocols, we call them. And in our studies, this is a rather specific area of knowledge or study. Now, the platforms may be costly. So you have to ask yourself what kind of data you want, how you get that data. But I haven't talked about cost because there's a lot of free of charge tools. You know, a lot of things on Google, for instance, is free of charge. But when we talk about tool-to-tool platform or using tools, to build platforms, when we build these platforms, there comes costs. According to the convenience of use, these platforms. The more convenient to use, the more costly. And then thirdly, we have the tools, and we want to build the platforms, but we also need expertise in data analysis. And that is a challenge. Number 3. How do we make sense of the data? And for the major takeaway here is that we have a plan for the use of our tools. You would know how to use the tools and the relationship among the tools. Now, let us go to the third question. Now, we haven't touched on big data yet. Why? Because the data that we talked about is really not a lot of data. It already seems overwhelming, right? But in the world of data, it's not big data because it's just within your organization or corporate. That's the data you're gathering. But for big data, you have to merge a lot of different sources, data from different sources. So the third question is an even deeper question. And that is, at the end of the day, how do you drive your business goal using data or big data that you have on hand? For this part, I don't have a lot of examples to share with you because it is a very big question, business goal. And for us in the artistic field, it is an even more remote question to us. And therefore, to me, what I want to share today is really life examples in the commercial field. And perhaps we in the artistic field can perhaps think about using them as well. Now, I talked about a business goal, how to drive our business goal. Let's say effective advertising. And perhaps you all have this experience, and that is after you search for something, the ads actually follow you to the grave, you feel. So this is one implementation for us. You have the different tools, and through the user's behavior that you want to find those people, identify those people, and follow them. So what are some examples of goals? There are 3 possible goals, and you hear people talking about this often. 1, let's say for a website, you want there to be personalized experience for the customer when visiting your store's website. And secondly, perhaps enhanced interaction and retentions by emails and messaging. Or thirdly, pricing responsiveness for your online sales. And perhaps you would want to make it free of charge for certain customers even. Let's say on Amazon, after you bought a book or whatever you've bought, your history and preferences will be used to give you or generate product recommendations. So this is a personalized store experience. They would say that the customers would be even more willing to make purchases on your platform. And here we see a lot of different tools. Again, I cannot talk about the tools today. We don't have sufficient time. But you see that there's machine learning, and then there will be recommendations generated. So there is a data stream, and out of that, recommendations will be generated. And among data platforms, the data will have to be shareable, and there will have to be learning. The machines will have to learn, and then there will be recommendations pushed. Just now, we talked about online purchase of books. Let's say on my website, the readers would have read certain information, and then we can recommend certain relevant books or events. And what about automatic emails or messages? You hi me, and I hi you back. Of course. Now, there's a very hot term, omni-channel marketing. And that is for all the marketing channels, they go through an omni-channel. So that's diverse channel, but it's the same message. You can WhatsApp me, email me, Facebook message me, but basically through the different channels, variety of channels, my interaction with you will always be focused and clear. I was told that I have 1 more minute to go. All right, so lastly, this is the diagram, and that is pricing. Ticketing, can it be like airline tickets? And that is a customer information and preferences can be used as information for me to set the price. Oh, definitely, we can do that. These things are all things that we can do. Just at how we do it involves, actions from the fundamental and base. So in the beginning, how do we get the data? How do we accumulate the data? And this is something that people have to answer you on the ground. So this is not like data that you have gathered and you can just put it there, because you have to put it through the funnel, through the 3 steps. And then after that, you will be able to deliver what you want in terms of business strategy or goal. So I've given you some examples from a lot of data. Slowly, we accumulate the data and boil down to through the funnel to knowledge and then business goal. So I've used a very little time to cover a very big topic. I hope I've given you some insight. Thank you, Dennis. It sounded complicated, but on the other hand, it seems like something that my organization is doing every day. Now, for the audience, if you have any questions from Dennis's sharing, you can write them down now, and then later on, you can input your questions onto the website. And next, our speaker will be speaking in English. For those of you who want Cantonese translation, would you please press on the channel? And for Putonghua users, can you please stay on the present channel? For those who want to listen to the English channel, can you please choose off? And those watching online would you please continue on your present language window? Now, you will be able to see on the chat box all the instructions.
Is the founder and director of the Dialogue, the Community Performance Network. He is an applied theater practitioner with experience in international drama education, community theater, and theater for development. Chris' ongoing research interests center around the documentation of performing arts practice. His organization is very unique in the knowledge management approach to support organization and independent practitioner to develop documentation and archival strategies, tools, models that will best demonstrate their impact and tailor to their needs, to the different stakeholders. So I have been very paying attention to the documentation and archival programs promoted by Chris' organization since years ago. So I'm very happy and excited to listen more about his work. So today his title is, for the presentation, is From Knowledge Management to Promotion, Why Documentation Matters. Chris, your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, and good morning to everyone from England. Thank you very much to the event organizers for having me. It's a shame that we cannot all be together, but this is the next best thing. It's also an honor to be presenting after Dennis's presentation, and I think what you'll find is there are some very interesting parallels between what he has been talking about and what I will be. I was particularly taken, Dennis, by you talking about using data, putting data into the funnel and then using the data that comes out of the funnel, and that's something that will be very relevant to my presentation as well as Dennis talking about the knowledge cycle, and I'll be talking about that in a slightly different context, but a very similar sort of philosophy. So let me share my presentation with you now. Right, so we've had some fantastic events today and yesterday, people talking about documentation, but I just want to clarify what I mean by documentation, because documentation does mean something slightly different to different people. As a term, it's something that is often considered in a historic perspective to just be sort of people with clipboards at the back of a room capturing evidence of what's going on, almost like an evaluator, someone who's sort of quite distant from the theatre practice. My argument is that it can also be something very much more creative, that it doesn't just have to be about that. And the sorts of data that Dennis was talking about is very important. We also have other types of data as well. We know that theatre and arts practice are very creative, participatory art forms. And so we can make our documentation very creative and participatory as well. So the essence of documentation is that it is something that is enduring and reproducible. This means that it is an actual document that will last forever. I have a piece of paper, or I have a video, or I have an audio recording. That's what I mean when I say enduring. And reproducible, in that I can copy it and I can give it to you. That's not something that theatre itself is. I cannot give you a theatre performance. You have to come and you have to see the theatre performance. That theatre performance is not going to last forever. That theatre performance, once it closes at the end of the night, no longer exists. There's nothing tangible that we can touch or share with people. Now, I have written an article which explores more about these basic philosophical concepts on documentation, which is part of the event, and so you can find that, I believe, on the IATC pages and website. But just to give you a very brief background into the organisation that I founded, we are a non-profit knowledge sharing network. We primarily work in the community performance space, or the applied theatre space. So this is anyone using the performing arts in a socially engaged context. So this might be performing arts in education, or in prisons, or in development, in healthcare, in hospitals. But we have been increasingly working with more conventional theatres and festivals in recent years, because whilst our initial focus was socially engaged organizations, we were getting more and more requests and demands from performance-based companies that we're not necessarily working with social participants, but we're just more traditional theatre spaces. So my main interest is building the capacity of performing arts practitioners to use documentation and archiving to support their work. And when we think about it, documentation and archiving is really about creating and curating knowledge, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail. But what sort of knowledge are we collecting? For the average performing arts practitioner, what we all need to support our work is a narrative or a story of impact. What is the impact that we're trying to have as theatre professionals? We're looking at resources that can demonstrate, that can explain, that can prove, that can communicate what impact our work is having. Why are we actually doing what we're doing? I'm sure that no theatre practitioner goes out to work in the morning and thinks, okay, I'm just here to create theatre. It doesn't matter what impact I have on the world. We all want to communicate something. We all want to achieve something with our audiences or our participants. So when we're talking about narrative of impact, we're thinking about what sort of thing are you planning, what is actually happening in the present, or what has happened in the past. We obviously can't capture every single element of a performance. If we do capture every single little element of a performance, the only real way of doing that is to recreate or restage the performance itself. We can't reproduce every little detail without staging the performance afresh. So really, we have to choose an aspect of the performance, or aspects in plural, different things that we want to focus on the documentation. But we know that we're not going to get every little thing. One problem with documentation is, of course, we start to document a process and you never quite know what is going to be the most significant thing, what's the most important part of your story until you've finished it. And so what we've sort of got to do is keep an open mind as we're planning our documentation and as we are creating our documentation, that are just like you would if you were a theatre director, that our documentation may be slightly different from the initial plan that you have at the beginning. So all of my documentation efforts and all of the documentation produced by my company focuses on impact. Now, I've chosen these two quotes here because they tell two very different stories of impact within the arts. There are a lot of artists and theatre practitioners who are quite resistant to the word impact. So this is a quote from an academic called Michael Balfour, who says, "The economic reliance on external donors and agencies sets up an agenda in which theatre practitioners come under pressure to comply with organisational priorities of targets and outcomes." This is a very complicated way of just saying, sometimes we feel, if we have funders saying, what's the impact you're having? What's the impact you're having? Artists feel that you're missing out on the art I'm creating, on the beauty I'm creating, on the fun experiences I'm creating. But I won't read this next quote, but I will just explain it, is that the other aspect of this is that, yes, nobody actually, no artist actually goes out without wanting to make an impact. That impact can be something like beauty, aesthetic excellence. It doesn't have to be an economic model of impact. And so that's very important if you hear artists say, but I don't want to prove what I'm doing because I just want people to enjoy it. Well, people enjoying it is in itself a very important impact. So why do we document then? Really, what we're trying to do is to provide access to processes that otherwise would not have been externally visible. So all of these pictures are pictures from dialogue projects. This is a performance that took place in Lusaka in Zambia. Now, unless I took this picture, unless I had videos to show to you, I would not be, these processes would not be visible to you as an audience in Hong Kong and at this conference. In terms of what we then use that documentation for, we have a whole range of different areas, from advocacy or promotion of our theatre practice to other people, education and training, maybe for new members of a company or for school students, university students, or if someone has never worked on other professionals who may never have worked on a similar project before. Funding is obviously very important. If we're able to document and demonstrate our impact, prove the impact we're having to funders, we're much more likely to receive the funding that we desire. Monitoring, evaluation, and learning. This is so important. This is monitoring. In some ways, it's a very similar thing to what Dennis was talking about, in that we're constantly monitoring our data, we're evaluating our data, and we're trying to learn from it. But when I talk about monitoring, evaluation, and learning, I'm also talking about it in terms of our actual theatre practice. So monitoring the impact that we're trying to have and we are having, evaluating to say, is this actually the impact we want to have? Is this the impact that me as a director or a producer or a choreographer that I want to have in my work? And then learning from that and fulfilling at the end of that cycle so that we can take our documentation, take the data that we have about our practice and improve our practice. Networking is so important. Without properly documented work, it's so difficult to share with colleagues from across the world what it is we're doing. And maybe we have some very similar interests that we wouldn't know if it wasn't captured in some way and we couldn't share it via emails or YouTube or whatever. Research, academic research is obviously very focused on documented materials. Academics are fantastic at documenting all of their work, normally through journal articles or research papers or at conferences. But really all of these things come round to increasing our ability to collaborate with other stakeholders in the sector, to avoid working by ourselves or avoid working independently. By having documentation, we can use that as a communication tool so that other people can understand what it is we're doing, we can understand what it is they're doing, and we can find areas that we can collaborate. Now, a lot of people tend to produce documentation at the end of a performance project or at the end of a series of workshops. This historically tends to be because funders require a end of project report, and if people think, oh, okay, quick, I've really got to put something together and I've got to just write a report as quickly as possible and send it in. But there are some really big problems with this because, as I said, the documentation should be used throughout the process so that we can learn from it, so that we can develop our practice, so that we can communicate with other people and collaborate with them during our project. We also know that documentation plans are different to what we end up creating and capturing, because, as I said, you don't know at the start of a documentation process what is the most important aspect. And so if you just write your documentation at the end, you may not have captured all of the various aspects of the project that actually by the end you think, oh, if only I had some video evidence of that, because that ended up being more important than the performance or the production element that I did capture on video. So I'm going to take this moment to move on to another aspect of my presentation. And this is similar in some ways to what Dennis was talking about in terms of a knowledge management cycle. Knowledge management is something that is incredibly important to us at Dialogue. We believe that documentation is not just an ending point. It is not the final part of a project. It is in many ways the beginning of new practice, the beginning of new innovation, new communication. And so everything I've talked about up until now, all of the documentation stuff that I've mentioned in very brief detail, but all of that only comes under this initial category of create. So what we're doing when we are documenting is we are harvesting knowledge. Within your organizations, or if you're an independent practitioner yourself, you have knowledge, you have skills, you have passion, you have finesse that people have developed over the years of their career. Or they might have developed over the weeks of a project or the days of a performance, but they have been creating all of this knowledge. What we need to do as documenters is we need to harvest that knowledge. We need to capture it. We need to turn it into something which is enduring and reproducible, that physical resource or digital resource that we can share. But all of that is only creating knowledge. What we then need to do is think about, okay, well, how do we put all of this knowledge together? Just like Dennis said, it's all very well having all these different tools, but what are we going to use it for? So we need to pull all the different strands together. We then need to think about organizing that data, setting it out in such a way that it becomes useful, it becomes meaningful for our organizations, and that it's something that we can utilize. So once we've organized that data, we're able to share it with our colleagues, we're able to share it with different partner organizations, different stakeholders, funders. And then finally, we can actually use those documents, use that knowledge that we have created, curated, organized, and shared to do something. Now, as soon as we utilize that to do something, we're creating new theatre practice. And so each time we need to, right, okay, we're creating something new, so we need to harvest the knowledge from that. And this is why it's a complete cycle. It's not anything that ever stops. It's not an end point. It's more of a beginning point, but it goes round and round and round. So what is knowledge management? I mean, knowledge management as a term is something which is more commonly used in the corporate sector, especially within the legal profession. The legal profession are particularly good internationally at harvesting knowledge from within their law firms, within their own organizations. It's also something which is incredibly well done by the medical profession. We've seen over the last months, over the last year, the situation with COVID. We know how well doctors and medical researchers can research, but they don't just write it up into a paper and keep it on their laptop. What do? They organize it, they send it out, they communicate it. And a piece of research that is done in Hong Kong on the latest COVID treatments gets shared with doctors all over the world. It doesn't just sit in one place doing nothing. That gets shared, that gets utilized. And then maybe a doctor in Brazil picks that up and goes, oh, well, we then tried it with this drug and this improves the efficiency even more. And so if we start thinking about how can we as performing arts practitioners learn from lawyers and medics, that's probably the easiest way of sort of thinking about knowledge management. So it's not just an academic exercise that is completed by just one or two people in an organization. It's not just about building complicated databases. It's not just about technological solutions. It's not just something for librarians and digital professionals to do. It's really a lot more encompassing than that. As many stakeholders as possible should be getting involved. As many members of your company, of your organization should be getting involved in this. Now, I'm going to share with you various different types of knowledge management cycle, and each one of these have come from an external source. The reason I'm doing this is to show you that there isn't one exact definition of knowledge management. Everyone has their own interpretation of it. So before, I was talking about creating and curating, organizing, sharing, and utilizing. This is a very similar concept, but they use different terminology. So they create, they share, they store, they use, and then they update. So again, it's still a cycle. So just like documentation itself, knowledge management is all about collaboration. It's all about bringing people together, sharing their knowledge around so that ultimately we can all work more effectively. We can all create more impact. Now, we know, to use the medical example, we know in a COVID situation, what effective work means is saving more lives. It means better treatments. But what does that mean in a performing arts context? Well, it can mean all sorts of things, in all honesty. But what it really means is, to me at least, is improving our aesthetic practice, improving the impact of our practice. And that might be through all sorts of different means, but the fact that we document and then we share it through the knowledge management cycle means that we can really work at pushing ourselves each day, each week, each month, each year, so that we don't just say, this is my practice, I'm not developing. We can use the documentation to learn from each other, to work with each other, and to develop. It's all about development. So it's improving efficiency. So instead of me creating a resource that someone in Hong Kong has already created, I can say, oh, well, actually, there's this wonderful idea that I've had from a colleague in Hong Kong, and I know about it because that documentation has been shared with me. Leveraging existing resources. So instead of creating a brand new toolkit for my workshop facilitators, I can say, oh, there's already an amazing resource from South Africa that does this. Improving learning, increasing impact. So all in all, knowledge management is collecting, curating knowledge, and connecting people to it. This is yet another version of the knowledge management cycle. So the first step here is creating and improving knowledge. The second step, distributing knowledge. The third step, using and adding knowledge. So what I'm really trying to communicate to you here is that it's not a step-by-step process like a recipe. It is a cycle, and it needs to be constantly changing and adapting and moving forwards. But I don't want you to think, like that first diagram I showed you, that it has to be this step, this step, this step. Different people will do it in different ways. And just like we are creative in different ways in our theatre practice, we should be the same with our documentation and with our management of all of this knowledge. So, right, I'm just going to return to, I mentioned before about all the different ways in which we use documentation. And this is effectively the same list, just in a little bit more detail. So documentation is informing research and teaching, supporting publicity campaigns, boosting advocacy initiatives, assuaging the fears of funders so that they're more confident in our work, stimulating learning opportunities, encouraging innovation, fostering networking and collaboration, saving unnecessary duplication of work, advancing our monitoring and evaluation initiatives, offering ideas, inspiration, reference points, and case studies of aesthetic quality and best practice. So for those of you who are interested in exploring this concept of knowledge management further in your organization, my initial task for you would be to go away after this session and think, right, okay, if I want to achieve all of these different goals, if I want to improve my performing arts practice in these different ways, does everyone within my organization or within my network of professional colleagues, does everyone have the knowledge that they need to complete these tasks properly and effectively? And in many ways, this is a question where I'm almost setting you up for failure, because I would argue that even the most organized and best implemented knowledge management structures within organizations can always improve. But just start to think about, right, what knowledge, what documentation, what evidence of impact do we need for these things to happen? Who do we need to share it with? How do we need to organize it? How can we then use it and learn from it? One of my big frustrations with the academic research world is how much wonderful expertise and intelligence goes into fantastically detailed academic research papers. And unfortunately, we know from the statistics that the vast majority of research papers do not get read more than a handful of times, which is really such a shame, because there's such important learning to be taken from those resources. So thinking about that, how would we, in an academic sense, if you were an academic researcher, how could you encourage colleagues and practitioners on the ground to use that and to take the learning from that and to put it into their own practice? So that's a parallel that we can think of when we're performing arts practitioners, right? I've created these wonderful resources, I've created these things, but I don't want it just to sit in a library on a shelf. I want people to use it. How can I go about that? This is yet another knowledge management cycle. This one is a little bit more detailed. I won't go into great detail on this, only to say that they have also included here a difference between the internal knowledge of an organization and the external knowledge. So these are two different types of knowledges that can often be work very effectively together. So again, I'm going to talk about different types of knowledge in a different context now. We have explicit knowledge. Now, this is something which is tangible, something that I can hold on to, a piece of paper or a video, or something that I can see, something that's visible, something that's public, something that's accessible. These types of knowledge and expertise tend to be the easiest to capture and to document. Tacit knowledge, which means something which is invisible or private, tends to happen in an office or in a rehearsal studio. It might be the processes or the exercises that we use for character development or for rehearsal that the audience never sees. But that may be a little bit more difficult to capture, but there are certainly ways of creatively capturing that. Remember, with any type of documentation, you have different types of people who will be using those resources. As we've explored, there's so many different purposes for it. So if you're sending the documentation to a funder, they may have a different language or a different way of describing something than if you were to send it to an actor. So sometimes we want to create a resource that everyone can use and everyone can learn from, and sometimes we need to create different resources for different people. Now, I'm just very quickly before I conclude, I'm going to speak about the power that documentation and knowledge has. There's a very common saying, knowledge is power. And we are effectively, when we're creating documentation and when we're sharing that, we are creating knowledge. Therefore, we are very powerful. We are telling a story and we have the power to tell the story in the way that we want to tell. And so with power comes great responsibility. So we need to think about creating documentation in a fair way. We need to think about the fact that any document we produce is subjective. It's our own personal take, our own personal viewpoint. It does not represent everybody. We need to make sure it's so important that people understand that documentation and even the sort of data that Dennis was talking about, they're not sort of politically neutral in any way. We are choosing subjectively, we're choosing what type of data we take, what type of data we present, what type of document we produce. And so we need to embrace the fact that this is a subjective thing, it's a creative thing. We can't say, here's the evidence and this is completely objective and you can't argue with it. So there's no way we're ever going to get it right. It's never going to be, oh, this is a perfect piece of documentation, because there will always, like if someone's writing a newspaper article, there will always be different opinions and different approaches.
Chris, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you very much. So, why is this all important? As we've said, documentation is enduring, it's reproducible, it's going to last. It's in 5 years' time, that resource is still going to be there. It leaves a legacy. It's not an end point, as we've explored. But really, because the documentation is all about harvesting knowledge and communicating knowledge, we are constructing, producing, contributing, shaping, revealing all of this knowledge. And we know that any type of knowledge revolves around people. It revolves around the artists you work with. It revolves around the funders you work with. So we have a responsibility to the stakeholders we work with to communicate about our practice in a way that doesn't harm or damage their reputations or their professional practice. Now, I'm just going to end very quickly by pointing you to some useful resources that you can use if you want to explore these concepts in more detail. Firstly, this is a book that was only published a few years ago called Documenting Performance, which I highly recommend. We also have this book, Applied Practice, Evidence and Impact in Theatre, Music and Art. Again, highly recommended. If you want to learn more about knowledge management, we have this knowledge management cookbook. Finally, in a Hong Kong context, if you want to learn more about knowledge management, there is a hub of knowledge management experts at PolyU. I've left their website links there. They run some short courses, and they also have an informal association of knowledge management practitioners. They actually ran a training session earlier this week, which I attended via Zoom. So you can get in touch with them. But of course, feel free to get in touch with us at Dialogue as well if you're interested in exploring this further. Right, thank you very much. I hope I haven't gone too over my time.
Thank you very much, Chris. Sounds like documentations to me, the skills that all reflective practitioners must acquire. Also, there will be a Q&A sections. Please use the Q&A function and feel free to send us your questions and comments in English or Chinese. So we're waiting for your questions. That's the first questions will be to Chris. And just say thank you to you. And while we are waiting for the questions, that sounds like as Dennis share about how and what we can get the data, especially in the internet, to gain more understanding about our potential and existing audience, to really to develop a new business model when we closely learn from the data trail. But while I'm thinking Chris emphasized the importance of the documentation in order to understand our own practice better, it seems you have to work in different sides when we working in our field, that we have to know more about external data, and also, as you said, about the internal data to know our practice more better, to create a new knowledge through deeply studying our practice, to inspire and learn, share. And most importantly for our future practice though. And let's see. Let me check.
So if I may just respond to, I think there's a comment from Bert here, talking about the fact I brought up the link between responsibility and the knowledge we're creating. And again, I would encourage people to consider that not only in light of my presentation, but also in terms of Dennis's presentation, and the responsibility that data analysts have in promoting our theatre practice, and the fact that if the different types of data we choose and the different types of evidence that we create, whether that is statistical data in terms of the number of clicks on a website, or whether it's creative writing, we still have a responsibility to choose and make very selective decisions about what data we use and what data we present to different people.
What we've done is, and Chris will give tips or for the individual practitioner that how they can start up the work on documentation on their own, on their daily practice, or what will we say something to them when they want to start up to do this kind of documentation?
Dennis, did you want to take that first? Or?
Yeah. Thank you. I think for the first thing is to really to understand the texture of the data I think is quite important, because as Chris has said, we as a presenter, or we as a data owner has a subjective view. Actually, is quite true. Whenever you want to get the information may be objective, or the data may be objective, but all the interpretation comes from the curation and also comes from the inner knowledge of the operations and perhaps also about the arts that we are doing. And especially when in the business world, is also called the in-business insights. That is definitely subjective. And so the one thing is that you know the data, I mean the texture of the data or the limits of the data. And the second thing is a little bit about the ethics is how you interpret, how you author that is something that is affecting how others would also to try to interpret that. And so that's why I think one of the very important things is, well, to get the data is of course the first one, but to ask the right question and to apply the right tools, and then to get the thing that you think is answering your question. I think that this is something that we have to achieve, and with some knowledge or with some catch up about the mechanism and also the inner knowledge of the tools that is quite important. I think in the next some years and next decades perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I completely agree, Dennis, and I think your analogy in your presentation, when you were selecting your tools, and for instance the washing machine or the washer dryer, it's so important. My first step for any practitioner or organization that wants to explore this, both sort of forms of the very data-driven statistical documentation and also the sort of documentation of artistic practice, is to identify the gaps in your organization, identify the gaps in the kitchen. What is it that you need to well, let's put one step in beforehand. Firstly, what is it that you want to create in that kitchen? What is it that you want as an organization to do? In terms of that improving, whether it's improving collaboration or it's allowing, creating learning opportunities, or like in Dennis's case, increasing ticket sales, work out what it is you want to do. The next step is then, right, okay, what knowledge am I missing in order to achieve this? So what data is it, or what knowledge, and then, right, how can I create that knowledge? And who, but so important, and again, exactly what Dennis was saying, and also what I was saying, is who needs to access that data? Who needs to be involved in it? Who do we need to share it with?
Okay, there's a question, but we're afraid that we don't have time to really tackle that question. But if it's really important question that Brett raised to us. So I just read the questions. The pandemic has urged us to change the way we look at things. What both of you think about the position of data with regards to a fan audience in a different way? Are we to use it more actively than we did before? And do we actively use our database to spread art with new tools? So I thank you very much, Chris and Dennis, sharing for you and your participation. I think there's a lot of information the audience have to digest and think about, and have a further discussion with all of us in this session. So please let us, all audience, please let us know if you have any feedback to filling out the questionnaire. And by ending this event, I will pass the mic to Bernice and Priscilla to say some words. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to express my deepest gratitude for Hong Kong Repertory Theatre's continuous support over the years. And I would also like to thank Hong Kong Arts Development Council for supporting this event. Although we cannot meet each other face to face, but still, we are able to learn from one another through this virtual platform. And I would like to thank all my colleagues, IATC colleagues, Hong Kong Repertory Theatre's colleagues, TBC colleagues for their hard work. And I also like to thank our interpreters as well. I really appreciate for our speakers and hosts for their great support, not only to us, to this particular event, but also they have contributed a lot in different aspects of performing arts documentation with creative strategies and passion. Of course, I would like to thank our audience for all of your participation and kind and supportive responses. We, of course, have recorded this event properly, and please stay tuned with us for revisiting the talks online later. And you can also see from our trailers, Hong Kong Repertory Theatre is going to have a show next year, and also for IATC, it's going to have another archival project for theatre photographies. So looking forward to seeing you all soon for our next events. And at this moment, I would like to thank you very much all of your contributions. Stay healthy and also stay positive.
我用廣東話啦，喺呢度多謝咁多位嘅嘉賓、觀眾同埋我哋嘅工作人員嘅。咁另外咧，就係我都好希望咧，我哋將來有機會再喺呢個議題上邊再繼續去討論。希望各位從事記錄工作嘅同業咧，加油努力。我哋而家暫時香港都係未有演出啦，咁但係我哋希望大家都會繼續一齊喺條路上邊，大家努力嘅。多謝晒咁多位。
Thank you very much.